Thank you for joining us as we continue in our DLife discussion. I'm Paul Ritchie. This is Cole Hughes, and I'm the senior pastor. He's the associate pastor here at First Baptist Hodgenville. And each week in our DLife, we have 5 passages that we read, and then one of those passages is a focal passage in which we discuss. And today, we're going to be discussing 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first 11 verses. As we come to this, Paul is now giving a declaration of what the gospel is. He is using probably what is an early century, early church creed about the reality of the work of Christ and the gospel. And then he calls to the understanding of why the gospel is true and really gives an apologetical defense on some of the things that were probably being said about the resurrection. And so today, as we talk about it, I want to encourage us to really think about our own salvation experience. What was our own encounter with the gospel? And I think it's important as we look today to also remember that the gospel should never grow old, but even as believers, we should enjoy hearing the gospel because of hearing of the greatness of God's work, that we can have a relationship with Him. So as we hear the words today, I hope that you will join us as we discuss this together. Cole, would you read those first 11 verses for us?
Now I would remind you, brothers, of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, in which you stand, and by which you are being saved, if you hold fast to the word I preached to you, unless you believed in vain. For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, that He was buried, that He was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then He appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then He appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, He also appeared to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unworthy to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and His grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we preach, and so you believed.
Wow, I think that's an amazing passage, powerful passage. And I think, I mentioned earlier, the reality is we should never grow old of hearing the gospel. I've heard people say it before. I'm sure you have as well. Well, all they did was talk about the gospel, and I've heard that before. Mm-hmm. Have you ever experienced that?
What do you mean? As
far as people coming to you, if you've taught about the gospel, they're like, yeah, that was okay. Or the attitude of that was okay, but I want to hear something different. It's like, I already know that story.
Yeah, it's almost like there's this attitude that if it's the same thing they've heard, then it's not, they're not growing.
Right.
It has to be something new, which is kind of a little bit scary because there really shouldn't be anything new added to what we've believed in other than a greater depth of understanding.
Well, and I think sometimes we come across things that we may have never engaged before. But I also think you're right. I think we just have this custom and this idea of been there, done that, got the t-shirt for it. But I think sometimes we just miss the intensity of what the gospel means. Mm-hmm. Think about it. It talks about the death, the burial, and the resurrection. And how often do we just talk about it as nonchalantly? Why do you think we allow ourselves to get to that place?
I think a lot of times it has to do with sort of the cultural Christianity that exists in America in particular, where it's almost like for some people probably more of a social club than it is a life-saving good news that they've believed and are participating in. It's almost like that the belief and understanding of the gospel is your price of admission, and then after that you just kind of disregard it. Mm-hmm. How many times you go to a movie and you get your ticket to get in, right, but then you just throw it away right after you leave. Sometimes sadly that's how the gospel's treated. It's that ticket of admission, how people view it, which is not that at all. It's the central foundation we're building our lives upon. And I think that's where, as we talked about, constantly hearing the gospel, constantly being aware of that is so important, because it's not just a ticket of salvation. It's the foundation that we're building our new life upon.
Well, I know sometimes you go to movies that may be huge blockbusters that are coming out, and I've seen people that will take that ticket, they'll just toss it after it's ripped up, they'll get to the door to go in, and somebody will say, "Can I see your ticket?" They're like, "What do you mean my ticket?" And I think that's a lot, you're right, with the gospel, that is how a lot of people treat it.
And that's sort of what Paul's talking about. Yeah. It's unless you believed in vain. It's like, I got my ticket, but do you have it? Or you walk out of a venue and you didn't get the stamp and you want to get back in. Wrestling tournaments were always that you walk out and you have to have the stamp.
Right.
And so that's, is it marking you? Is it a part of your life? Is it saturating who you are? And that's where, the idea of unless you believed in vain, it's saving you, So.
Yeah. Well, I think that's huge. I mean, how many times have we heard people really receive Christ as fire insurance? They don't want to go to hell. But they miss that it's not about not going to hell. I mean, that's part of it. That's a great part of it. But it's so much greater than that. It's to be reconciled with God, your Creator, who has desire to bless you, really. And not maybe in the way we think, but in a much greater way.
Well, I think it's the true aspect of what's happening. I mean, it's the exchange. It's the death of the old self, the new self. It's the living, the lordship of Christ. It's all of these things that are, the being saved from hell is definitely a part of it, and that's a part that usually helps people understand their sinfulness and their need for a Savior. But for many, I think that's what it is. It's I'm going to get that just because.
Yeah, it's that fire insurance idea. And I think also what the Apostle Paul does is pretty genius. He realizes that probably the church in Corinth has heard the rumors that Jesus' body was stolen by the disciples, or, at this point probably it had not been thought about. It was later, but the people that say, well, the disciples were hallucinating that they saw Jesus. The Apostle Paul attacks those pretty pointedly because he mentions the 12 saw the risen Lord, and then he says, and I saw him personally, but he says over 500. That's pretty big.
Yeah.
And I love how he says, and some of them are living. I think we miss that the Bible itself gives evidence for the resurrection. And I think you've probably encountered it. I've encountered it where people want to talk about, well, the resurrection isn't true. But I think we use this illustration, and I'm sure you've read this as well, the hallucination idea. 500 people having the same hallucination. That's a little bit weird, a little bit off. But I think this passage also, I love the idea that you bring into the vain part. And I wonder how often we focus more on how we live on the vanity side of receiving the gospel. Like you said, it is a status for us. But I wonder if we're not cautious, what are some things you see here that could maybe be warnings to believers in this passage? Maybe of, hey, look at your life type moments. You see anything there?
Yeah, I think it really is the kind of the call. I think we saw it even earlier about the foundation. It's that if these things don't ring true to you, if this isn't what you're building your life on, it's gonna fall. I mean, it's in vain. It's the idea of you look around us, and the cultural Christianity that we have had is fading very quickly.
Yes.
Because that's not what the gospel is. It's not about a social club. It's not about the social aspects. And so when push comes to shove, that's not going to stand.
Right.
When something better in their eyes comes along, then that's what they'll do. And that's what they'll whenever there's something more advantageous, that's what comes along. I think it's the idea, it's like, hey, this is what matters.
Yeah.
All that other stuff that you may be concerned with, he's addressed that so much in 1 Corinthians. Like, no, it's not Paul and Apollos.
Right.
It's about Jesus. It's not this or that. It's about this.
Yeah.
Can you just get focused? And he's really finishing it up like, hey, this is what you believed in. This is where your hope is. If it's not in this, it's in vain. And I think that's really his final call to the church in Corinth in his first letter.
Well, and I think the call to the gospel is so imperative for us to understand. I think we miss it today. I think we don't stop enough to reflect on what does it mean the moment I entered into that relationship with Christ. I don't think we reflect enough on that. And because we don't reflect enough on that, I think we then, as a result, don't reflect enough on what it truly means to follow Christ. Yeah. And really, you think about the book of Corinthians, he's really saying, reflect and remember, look at your own life and adjust based on the reality of the gospel. I do think this letter is wonderful because Paul is very pointed, he's very direct, but he's also very clearly saying the gospel must be primary. And I think that's one of the reasons why when we teach, we preach, we talk, the gospel in our language must be primary. and why we must never grow old. In fact, every time I teach and preach and the gospel's included, or if I'm studying, it's that reminder of God's grace and how amazing that is. We sing the hymn Amazing Grace, but do we truly believe it in the sense of in recalling it? So if we think about 1 Corinthians 15, is there anything you'd want to say in closing?
I think it's just the constant reminder. I think the idea that when we remember why, it encourages us to do the work that we should be doing, not because it saves us, but because of what's been done. You think about the reason you buy insurance, car insurance is because in the untimely event, well, that doesn't make you not obey traffic laws, right? And he talks about in his own life, and Paul did, about how I've worked harder than all of them because of the grace given to me, not because I'm special. But really that should motivate us. If we ever find ourselves being lax, we need to really remember, well, what did Christ do for me? Because when we think of that, it's a lot harder to be proud. It's a lot harder to think of yourself higher than others because you realize how poor and wretched you are. And so I think that's very important, just to constantly remember, because out of that mindset, that's that dying to self daily, is really preaching the gospel to yourself daily, I think, is just so important in the Christian life. Absolutely. And not only preaching to yourself, but I think that idea of reflection, of remembering the moment of salvation. What was it like when you recognized you were lost and then you became redeemed? And, and I think, again, to go along with this is that idea that Paul talks about, I was saved, I am being saved, I will be saved. So when remembering the gospel is past, present, and future, and I think that helps us live in it constantly. When we look at this passage, when we have walked through 1 Corinthians, we recognize that the Apostle Paul is directly addressing the importance of believers being faithful to the gospel. He identifies a lot of different temptations that the church in Corinth is dealing with and difficulties, but he calls them to faithfulness. And I would challenge each of us as we look at books like 1 Corinthians and we continue reading to ask the deep questions for ourselves. Am I living for Christ, or am I living in vain? And I think that's a very important question, because we can be living and saying we believe in Jesus but still have a vanity of faith, in the sense of we're believing with the wrong purpose. We have a knowledge about God but aren't known by God. And I would challenge us as we continue reading that we ask that question: do I remember the moment when I didn't just simply know about God but became known by God? And do I hold to the truth of the gospel? Keep on reading this week as we continue on. We look forward to discussing things with you again next week. Again, I'm Paul Ritchie. This is Cole Hughes, and we are so excited that we here at First Baptist get to engage in your life and have a gospel conversation. We'll see you next week.